The first thing Mara noticed about the dying king was his hands. She had served enough people in 22 years to know hands the way a mechanic knows engines, by their wear, their calluses, by what they reached for without thinking. The king's hands were enormous, even flat against the obsidian table where they had laid him, fingers spread like a man trying to stop himself from falling. They were wrong somehow. Too still. The knuckles ridged like old scar tissue. The nails, if you could call them that, were dark at the base, going black the way a bruised fruit goes, and the blackness was moving. She could see it moving, creeping toward the second joint of each finger, slow as ink dropped in still water. She was not supposed to be here. That was the first truth Mara held onto as the doors of the inner sanctum boomed shut behind the senior advisor who had, in a moment of obvious and acute desperation, grabbed her by the apron strings in the corridor outside the royal kitchen and hauled her through 3 hallways, 2 antechambers, and 1 threshold she was technically never permitted to cross. The second truth was simpler. She had a pot of broth on the fire and she had not turned it off. You, the advisor, his name was Counselor Veth. She had heard his name but never spoken to him, never been in a room where speaking to him was something she would be allowed to do, pointed at her with 3 fingers, which among the Verk was the gesture for a task assigned without choice of refusal. You were raised on Sector 12. It was not a question. Mara set her jaw. Yes. Your mother was a contact healer. She cleaned wounds and set bones. She wasn't certified. She worked with the Gret sickness in 09. The Gret sickness. Mara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the king's blackened hands. The Gret sickness had killed 4,000 people in Sector 12 in the span of 11 days. It had killed her mother in the span of 3. It had not, through a mechanism she had never fully understood and had spent years trying not to think about, killed Mara. I was 9, she said. You survived it. A lot of people survived it. 31 out of 4,000. Counselor Veth looked at her the way she had seen men look at the last flask of clean water in a desert. You are the only survivor currently within the palace walls. Mara looked at the king. The king did not look at her. His eyes were half open, rolled slightly back, and the irises silver, the way all Verk irises were silver, like something hammered rather than grown, had gone cloudy at the edges. His breathing was audible from 3 meters away. A wet, labored sound. A sound that carried inside it its own ending. What happened to the 25 healers? She asked. Veth's jaw tightened. He was a tall man, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been holding difficult things in check for a very long time. Right now it was holding in something that looked close to collapse. 18 are dead, he said. The other 7 are, he paused. Incapacitated. She looked at the king's hands again. The blackness had crept another millimeter since she'd first walked in. She was sure of it. Incapacitated how? The first healer to make contact lost consciousness within 4 seconds. The ones after that took precautions. It didn't matter. Something in what he's carrying now, it transmits on contact. The last 3 healers to attempt direct treatment didn't survive the hour. And you brought me in here. You survived the Gret sickness. I was 9. You survived it, Veth said again, and this time his voice had stripped down to something bare. That means something in you resisted it. Some immunity, some biological factor we have not been able to identify in 30 years. And right now, with 18 of our finest healers dead, and the king's heart rate dropping by 1 count every 7 minutes, that factor is the only variable left we have not tried. Myra looked at the king for a long moment. His name was Aldrich Vaz IV, keeper of the compact, alpha of the 100 lines, sovereign of everything between the rim and the deep galactic fold that humans had taken to calling the wound. He had ruled for 40 years. He had never, according to every record, every transmission, every piece of intelligence that had filtered down through 12 tiers of hierarchy, to eventually reach the gossip of the kitchen staff. He had never once been sick. He looked, right now, like a man who had been sick for a very long time and was tired of pretending otherwise. "I need to know exactly what happened before he presented symptoms," Mara said. Veth looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, not quite relief, something in between that had not quite chosen which one it was going to be yet. "Tell me," she said, "everything from the beginning." The beginning, as Veth told it, was 3 weeks ago. A transit point at the edge of the compact's fourth quadrant, a place the navigational charts labeled simply as Junction 11. The king had been conducting a standard inspection tour, 40 ships, full escort, the kind of movement that was meant to demonstrate stability rather than accomplish anything logistically meaningful. A show of presence. Something had come in from the dark. Mara sat in a chair that was probably worth more than her entire sector's yearly food allocation and listened to Veth describe it the way witnesses always described things that made no sense. In fragments, circling the center of the thing repeatedly without landing on it, each pass getting slightly closer. A shape. A signal that wasn't a signal. A distortion in the transit field that 17 different instruments read in 17 different ways, none of them consistent. And then, nothing. The distortion resolved. The escort reported nothing unusual. The king completed his inspection and returned to the palace. The first symptom appeared 6 days later, a discoloration at the base of his left thumb. "He didn't report it," Veth said. His attendants noticed it during the 3rd morning service. He dismissed it, told them it was a bruise. Veth's voice was flat in the way that voices went flat when they were containing anger that had nowhere useful to go. "It wasn't a bruise." "No," Mara agreed, "it wasn't." She had crossed the room while Veth talked and was now standing beside the table where the king lay, close enough to see the texture of the blackness on his hands. It wasn't like bruising. It wasn't like the Gret sickness either, not exactly, but it rhymed with it. The same feeling of something progressing according to its own logic, indifferent to the body it was moving through. The Gret sickness had always felt to her, even as a child, maybe especially as a child, because children were closer to the true nature of things than adults generally admitted, like something that was not malicious. Just moving, just doing what it did. She had survived it because she had understood that. Somehow. At 9 years old, running a fever of 41 degrees in a quarantine tent with her mother dying 3 meters away, she had understood that the thing killing everyone around her was not trying to kill them. It was simply trying to be what it was, in a place that could not accommodate what it was, and the accommodation problem was proving fatal. She had stopped fighting it. She did not know even now how exactly she had done that. Her body had done it, maybe. Some below-language negotiation between her cells and the invading thing, conducted in a medium she had no conscious access to. She looked at the king's hands. The blackness moved. She watched it move. When the first healer touched him, she said, what was her method? Standard Verk diagnostic protocol, chromatic pressure mapping along the... No, Mara shook her head. Not the technical name. What did she actually do with her hands? Veth paused. She pressed her palms flat against his chest. That's the initial contact point for chromatic mapping it requires. She pressed, Mara said, hard. That's the protocol. The pressure is calibrated too. She pressed hard, against something that was already stressed. Mara looked at the king's face. Still that cloudy half-consciousness, the wet labored breath. And she died in 4 seconds. Yes. And the ones after her, they used instruments, barriers. All manner of them. Shielded probes, filtration arrays, contact suits rated for level 7 biological hazard. The thing transmitted through all of it. Mara was quiet for a moment. In the silence she could hear the king's breathing and underneath it, very faint, something that might have been the king himself. A low, unpatterned sound, almost subvocal, almost not there. She had heard something like it before. In the quarantine tent. in the hours before her mother stopped responding. Not pain exactly, too shapeless for pain. Pain had an object, a direction. This was more like a signal that had lost its receiver, broadcasting into nothing. "Has anyone tried not touching him?" Mara asked. Veth stared at her. "I'm sorry." Has anyone simply been near him? Without instruments, without protocol, without doing anything at all, just been present. The counselor's expression cycled through several things in quick succession. The goal is to treat him, being present without intervention. I know what the goal is. Mara pulled her chair closer to the table and sat down in it. I'm asking if anyone has tried the other thing first. She could feel Veth behind her, processing this, trying to map it against any framework he had for how problems got solved. She did not look back at him. She looked at the king's hands. The blackness moved. She breathed. Her mother had a saying, "The body is always trying to tell you what it needs. The trick is to be quiet enough to hear it." Mara's mother had learned this from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, a chain of women stretching back through 3 generations of Sector 12. The poorest, most resource-stripped sector in the compact, the one that got the old equipment and the expired rations and the second-hand medical protocols that the inner sectors had stopped using a decade before. The kind of sector where you learned to make do, where you learned to listen, because listening was free. Mara had worked in the palace kitchens for 6 years. She had found the job through a labor exchange program that the compact offered as a gesture of integration. They brought humans from the outer sectors in to work the service roles, the unseeable jobs, and called it an opportunity. Mara had called it a paycheck and a roof, and on the days when the head chef was distracted, access to cooking equipment that would have cost her a year's wages to rent back in Sector 12. She had learned the palace's rhythms in 6 years, the way the Verk organized their days, the way they ate, slowly, deliberately, everything portioned according to its caloric and chemical content, nothing consumed for pleasure because pleasure in consumption was considered a form of disorder. The way they spoke to each other, always through the formal register, even in private, even in anger, because the Verk had decided several centuries ago that the informal register was a vulnerability and had legislated it nearly out of existence. She had learned, without anyone teaching her, the specific loneliness of people who had organized their entire civilization around the idea that need was weakness. She looked at the king's face. Under the cloudy silver of his eyes, under the labored breathing and the moving darkness in his hands, there was something that she recognized. She had seen it in the quarantine tent. She had felt it in herself. He was waiting for it to stop. Not fighting past fighting. He had gone somewhere beyond the territory of struggle, into a place where the only thing left was endurance, and even that was getting thin. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. She was not sure he could hear her. She said it anyway. "I don't know what this is, that moving thing in your hands. I don't know what it's called or where it came from. I survived something once that I didn't understand either, and I didn't understand it because there wasn't anything to understand, not in the way you understand problems you can take apart. You can't take apart the dark." She paused. The king's breathing continued, unchanged. "You can only stop fighting it." Nothing, his hands on the obsidian table, the blackness moving. She reached out and placed her hand, palm flat over his. Behind her, Veth made a sound. She did not look back. The blackness was not hot as she had expected. It wasn't cold either. It was, and she tried to find a word for this later and kept failing, kept reaching for language that did not quite fit. It was present. That was the closest she could get. It was the most present thing she had ever touched. More present than stone, more present than her own skin. It had a quality of absolute there-ness that made everything around it seem slightly less real by comparison. She breathed. She did not press, she did not probe. She simply rested her hand on his and breathed, the way her mother had taught her to breathe in the quarantine tent, not the held breath of someone bracing against something, but the even, unhurried breath of someone with nowhere else to be. The clock on the far wall of the sanctum counted 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Veth did not speak. She could hear him not speaking, the enormous effort of it. At 3 minutes and perhaps 40 seconds, the king's hand moved. Not much. A faint turn of the wrist, almost involuntary, the way a person's hand moved in sleep toward a warmer part of the bed. His palm shifted under hers, and she felt something change in the quality of the contact. The presence that had been pushing, and she realized only now, only in its absence, that it had been pushing. A constant outward pressure she had been meeting with an equal stillness. The pressure eased. Not gone, just eased. She breathed, she waited. At 7 minutes, the king's eyes focused. He looked at her, the way people looked at things that didn't fit the world they thought they were living in. She had seen that look before, too. On the faces of the intersector Verk when she had walked through a corridor they hadn't expected a human to be using. On the faces of the palace officials who had occasionally wandered into the kitchen and found her correcting a spice ratio on a dish that a certified Verk chef had been preparing. Not hostility, not even quite disbelief. Something more like the look of a man who has been certain about the shape of a wall and has just discovered a door in it. "You," the king said. His voice was wrong, rough, stripped down, not the formal register, just sound shaped into meaning. "You are not healer class." "No," Mara said, "I'm a cook." He blinked. The silver of his eyes was clearing, the cloudiness retreating from the edges inward, slow as a tide going out. "Why?" He stopped, tried again. "How are you?" Another stop. The formal register was clearly beyond him right now, and Mara watched him navigate that with an expression she recognized from every patient she had ever sat with in Sector 12. The slight shame of a person who has been reduced to something they considered too basic to show. "I'm not doing anything," she said. "That's sort of the point." He looked at her hand on his. He looked at it for a long time. "The healers," he said, 25. "Yes." "They all." "Yes." Something moved across his face. She could not read Verk expressions with complete confidence even after 6 years in the palace, but she had gotten better at the general shape of things, and the general shape of what crossed his face now was something she would have called in a human face grief. Not for himself. The other kind. "I didn't," he stopped again. "I ordered them to, I told them to find a way, whatever it took." "I know," she kept her voice even, not gentle, not clinical, just level. "That's a thing you're going to have to live with." His eyes came to hers. Whatever he had expected, deference, comfort, some formal expression of condolence from a woman who was technically so far below him, in the hierarchy of the compact that they should not have been able to speak to each other at all. It was clear he had not expected that. Good, she thought. "The darkness," he said. "From Junction 11, I could feel it entering the inspection arrays, coming through the filters. He paused. "I thought if I didn't acknowledge it, it would. It would pass." He looked at her. "That never works," Mara said, "for anything." Counselor Veth had backed to the far wall of the sanctum. He was watching the conversation with the expression of a man, witnessing something that was rearranging several significant assumptions about how the universe was organized. The king, who had in the past 40 minutes managed to sit upright on his own and whose hands, while not cleared entirely, showed the blackness retreating from the fingers toward the palm at a rate visible enough to track. The king was speaking to the cook from Sector 12 in a register that, to the best of Veth's knowledge, had not been used in a formal royal context since the reforms of the Third Compact. Not the formal register. Not even the administrative register. Something older. Closer to conversational, closer to human. Veth had spent 40 years in service to the compact. He thought he knew the shape of every room. He thought he understood the grammar of power and who got to hold it and why. He was discovering, perhaps not as understanding as he had thought. "The thing from Junction 11, the king said, not a question. A returning to it the way you return to a thing you needed to understand. You know what it is. I have a theory, Mara said. Tell me. She had spent 6 years in the palace saying only what she was asked to say, going only where she was permitted to go, taking up precisely the amount of space that was allocated to her. She spent a moment with the strangeness of being asked by the Alpha King of the Compact what she thought. There's a thing in Sector 12, she began, a plant. We call it darkroot, not a formal name, just what people started calling it. It grows in the sublevel tunnels where the light doesn't reach, and it produces this. She tried to find a word that would translate. A spore, a microscopic particle that it releases when it's under stress. The spore enters the bloodstream and behaves like a foreign body. The immune system attacks it, and the attack generates a biochemical cascade that looks, on the surface, almost identical to 3 different diseases that we have formal protocols for treating. And so every doctor who encounters it treats it as one of those 3 things. And the treatment makes it worse, the king said. Activates it, she said. The spore goes dormant when the plant isn't stressed. The immune response is stress. The treatment is stress. Every intervention triggers a deeper dormancy resistance, a harder shell around the infection. She paused. 25 healers all intervened. All tried to address it directly. All caused the spore, or whatever this is, to harden its defenses. The king was quiet. The blackness on his hands, visible receding now, centimeter by centimeter, as the not pressing, the not fighting, the simply being present continued its slow work. And you, he said, you are not intervening. I'm just here. He stopped, started again. In 40 years of rule, no one has ever said that to me. I'm just here. Everyone who approaches me has a purpose, a goal, a protocol. He looked at his hands, even the healers. Especially the healers, Mara said. Something that she would have called, in a human face, a near smile crossed his. It did not fully form, but the shape of it was there. The spore, he said, what resolves it in Sector 12? Time, quiet, sometimes warmth not applied, just ambient. The plant is from a cold, dark environment. It does better when stressed because stress is familiar. What disorients it is, she thought about how to say it. Ease, comfort, things it doesn't have a response protocol for. The king looked at her steadily. You are saying the organism consuming my bloodstream is confused by kindness. I am saying it's from the dark. It doesn't know what to do with light. The room was very quiet. From somewhere distant in the palace, the muffled sound of the watch change, the hollow boom of the 3rd-hour drum. We could not have found this, Veth said from the wall. His voice was careful, precise. The voice of a man trying to be accurate about something that was costing him something. Our healers, our protocols, we could not have found this. No, Mara agreed, because your protocols assume that something wrong is attacking, that the correct response is to attack back. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way her mother had said hard things, factually, because the facts were the most respectful thing you could offer someone in pain. That's not always what's happening. By the 5th hour, the king was standing. Not steadily and not for long, he stood for perhaps 3 minutes, then sat again, not from weakness but with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the protocols of their own body. But he stood. The blackness on his hands had retreated to the base of his left thumb, a small dark island where there had been an advancing continent, and his breathing was clear. Veth had sent for food. When the tray arrived, standard royal nutrition rations, everything caloric and chemical, nothing pleasurable. Mara had looked at it and said, "That's not going to help." She had gone to the kitchen herself, the only person in the room who knew how to get there, and had come back 40 minutes later with broth. The pot she had left on the fire was, as she had feared, scorched at the bottom. She started a new pot. She made it the way her mother had made it, bone-based, long-simmered, seasoned with the 7 dried herbs that Sector 12 cultivated in window boxes and on rooftops, and in whatever small patches of soil could be found in the corridors between the sublevels. Simple, old, the kind of recipe that had been refined across generations not by professional hands, but by the accumulated knowledge of people who could not afford for things not to work. She brought it back in a clay cup. The king looked at the clay cup the way he had looked at her, with the expression of a man discovering a door in a wall he had thought was solid. "What is this?" he said. "Broth," she said. "Broth." "Yes." He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he lifted it in both hands. The gesture felt deliberate, both hands, the way you held something you were treating with care, and drank. He said nothing for a long moment after. Then, "I don't have a formal register word for this." "For what?" "For this." He held the empty cup, "the thing that this is." Mara looked at him. She thought about 22 years of being too far down in the hierarchy to matter. About 6 years in a palace that had organized itself entirely around the premise that need was weakness and comfort was disorder. About her mother, who had died 3 meters away from her in a quarantine tent after spending her life with both hands open, giving whatever she had to whoever needed it. "We call it comfort," she said. "Where I'm from." The king turned the clay cup in his hands. "Comfort," he repeated, in the informal register, as if trying the shape of a word he had heard in a foreign language. "Yes," Mara said, "that." The healer delegations arrived at the 8th hour. 14 of them from the remaining certified practitioners of the compact's inner sectors, the ones who had not been called to the first 25, who had been traveling or sleeping or working on the outer tour when the king had first fallen. They came in with their instruments, their shielded probes, their filtration arrays, their level 7 contact protocols. They stood in the doorway of the sanctum and looked at the king. Sitting up, color returned to his face, both hands clear of blackness except for the small retreating island on his left thumb, drinking a second cup of broth. They looked at the cook sitting beside him. One of the senior healers, a woman named Prithivaz, no relation to the king, but carrying the name suffix that indicated graduated status in the medical hierarchy, looked at Veth with an expression that had several layers to it. "Counselor," she said. "Yes," said Veth. "Is this," she looked at Mara, looked away back, "is this?" "This," said Veth, "is Mara. She works in the kitchen." He paused. "She is currently the most qualified person in the palace to treat the king's condition. I would recommend you listen to her." The quality of silence that followed this statement was something Mara would remember for a long time. It had weight. It had texture. It was the silence of 14 highly trained professionals absorbing the restructuring of a framework they had spent careers building. Prithivaz turned to Mara. Her expression had gone careful, professional, the way trained people went careful when they were recalibrating. "Tell me," she said, in the formal register, the same register she would have used with another certified healer, "what you found." Mara told her. She told her everything: the dark root, the spore, the mechanism of stress activation, the way every intervention had reinforced the organism's defenses, the non-intervention, the broth. She spoke precisely, using what technical language she had and plain language where she didn't, and Prithivaz listened with the quality of attention that Mara associated with very good doctors, the kind who already knew a lot and were interested in the fact that something existed they didn't know yet. When Mara finished, Prithivaz was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to her colleagues and began issuing instructions in a rapid technical shorthand that Mara could not follow. There was a burst of activity, instruments produced, calibrations made, a debate she could not follow but which resolved in under 3 minutes with all 14 healers agreeing on something. Then Prithivaz turned back. "The organism," she said, "we're reading it now. With passive sensors, no active signal, no pressure, just reading." She paused. "It's consistent with what you described, a stress-reactive encapsulated organism, cold dark origin, currently in a partial dormancy state. She looked at the king. How long since you treated it, the non-treatment? About 8 hours, Mara said. 8 hours. Prithviraj looked at the small dark island on the king's left thumb. 18 healers are dead because the first point of contact generated a stress response that cascaded into. She stopped. Started again, more quietly. One of my colleagues was in that first group. I know, Mara said. I'm sorry. Prithviraj looked at her. The formal register, the careful professional face, something in both of them shifted, just slightly. The way things shifted when you stopped performing a thing and started just being in it. You couldn't have known, Mara said. Your protocols are built for what you've encountered. This was something different. It came from the dark, Prithviraj said. Yes. From Junction 11, the edge of the compact. That's where the king encountered it, yes. Prithviraj was quiet for a moment. There is a great deal we have not encountered, at the edges. She said it like someone saying a thing they had known for a while and had not previously allowed themselves to say out loud. Yes, Mara said. There is. They kept her in the sanctum for another 3 hours while the healer delegation worked at passive monitoring, careful mapping of the organism's retreat, the slow cataloging of something new. The king sat and drank broth when it was brought to him and answered questions when he was asked them, and at one point fell into a sleep so complete and so immediate that Mara realized he probably had not slept properly in 3 weeks. She sat by the table while he slept and watched the dark island on his thumb shrink. She thought about Sector 12, about the window box herbs and the rooftop gardens and the accumulated knowledge of people who could not afford for things not to work, about her mother's hands, smaller than hers, more calloused, always moving, always open. She thought about the thing that had come from Junction 11, from the dark of the spaces between the compact's territory and whatever lay beyond it. She thought about how it had arrived in the king's bloodstream and done what it did, not out of malice, not with any intelligence she could identify, just following the logic of its own nature. She thought about how 25 highly trained professionals had met it with the only language they knew, intervention, correction, the forcible redirecting of a wrong thing toward rightness, and how the organism had simply done what stressed organisms did, had hardened, had dug in, had taken people with it when it went. She thought about what lay in the dark beyond Junction 11. What else might be out there, moving through the spaces between things, not malicious, not intelligent, just doing what it did. What other encounters might be coming, for a compact that had organized itself entirely around the premise that every problem could be addressed with the right protocol. She thought about what her mother had said. The body is always trying to tell you what it needs. She thought also, and sometimes the body is not alone in a room. Sometimes it is an entire civilization. And civilizations had bodies too, in their way. They moved and breathed and grew and got sick. And sometimes what made them sick was not an enemy but simply something new, something from outside the range of what they had encountered, and the protocols that had always worked before were suddenly, terrifyingly, not enough. She wondered if anyone in this palace had thought about that. She wondered if the king had thought about it. She looked at him sleeping. She thought he probably had. When he woke, it was late. The sanctum had thinned out. Most of the healer delegation had withdrawn to a side chamber to compile their observations, and Veth had gone somewhere to do whatever counselors did at the end of days like this. The room was quieter than it had been, though not empty. 2 palace guards stood at the door, and Prithviraj was still there, at the far end of the room, working with quiet focus on something Mara couldn't see. The king looked at his hand. The dark island on his thumb was very small now, the size of a thumbnail, the size of a coin. He pressed his other thumb gently against it, the lightest possible pressure, and watched it, and took his thumb away and breathed. "You learned something in the quarantine tent," he said. Mara looked up from where she was sitting. She had been almost asleep herself. "Yes." What did you learn? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about 9 years old, fever of 41 degrees, her mother dying 3 meters away, the sense of something vast and indifferent moving through the space she occupied. The panic first, the fighting. The way fighting made it worse, made the thing more present somehow, more inescapable. And then she still didn't fully know how, still didn't have language for the exact mechanism, the moment when she had just stopped. Stopped fighting. Stopped bracing. Let the thing be what it was in the space of her body, without trying to make it be something different. I learned that some things can't be beaten, she said. They can only be allowed to pass, given enough room to move through. The king looked at her steadily. And if they don't pass? Then you know something real, Mara said. About the thing, about yourself, about what you're actually dealing with. She paused. But they usually pass if you let them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in 40 years of rule, I have never lost anything I did not fight for first. Every inch of the compact, every treaty, every resource negotiation. I have fought for all of it. I know. I do not know how to not fight. You just did, Mara said, for the last hour while you were sleeping. Something moved across his face again, the almost smile. This time it made it slightly further, not quite all the way, but further. Your people, he said, Sector 12. Yes. They are, he paused, found a word, poorly resourced. That's one way to put it. The compact's allocation protocols for outer sectors are based on, he stopped, started again. I have received reports about the outer sectors, about Sector 12 specifically. I have received reports for 40 years. Yes, Mara said, you have. The pause between them had weight. I did not read them with adequate attention, the king said. It was not an apology. It was something harder than an apology. A statement of fact about a failure, made without the softening frame of contrition, made the way someone spoke when they were trying to be precise about something painful rather than forgiven for it. Myra looked at him for a moment. She thought about her mother. She thought about 31 survivors out of 4,000. No, she said, you didn't. He accepted that. He held it. The herbs you used, he said finally, in the broth. 7 of them, we grow them in window boxes, rooftop patches. Their names. She named them. He listened with the quality of attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened to things he considered important, total, uninterrupted, the way you listened when you actually intended to remember. I will want a full account, he said, of the Sector 12 cultivation methods, the medicinal applications your people have developed outside the formal compact protocols. He paused. There is knowledge at the edges that we do not have at the center. Yes, Mara said, there is. And there are things at the edges, coming from the dark beyond them, that we do not know how to face. That our protocols do not cover. Yes. We will need people who know the edges. He looked at her. People who know what the center does not. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about 6 years in a kitchen, about the labor exchange program that the compact offered as a gesture of integration, about the word integration and what it meant and what it might mean differently. That's going to require some changes, she said, to how the compact is organized. Yes, the king said. That's going to be complicated. Yes. A lot of people are going to resist it. They always do. He looked at his hand, the dark island, smaller now than a coin, smaller than a fingernail, a spot. They will adapt, given time, given, he paused. Tried the word again, still careful, still new in his mouth, given room to move through it. Myra looked at the spot on his thumb. She thought it might be gone by morning. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. At junction 11, when the thing came through from the dark, you felt it enter the inspection arrays, you said. You felt it coming. Yes. And you thought. I thought if I didn't acknowledge it, it would resolve. He said it evenly. I know, you told me, that never works. No, Mara agreed. It doesn't, she paused, but you're acknowledging it now. The king looked at her. The silver of his eyes cleared entirely, catching what remained of the sanctum's night lamps. Something in his expression that she had no word for in any language she knew. You are very direct, he said, for a cook. I'm from Sector 12, she said. We can't afford not to be. The almost smile reached his eyes this time. Didn't quite break into something fully formed, but the voltage behind it was real. No, he said, I imagine you cannot. Prithviraj found Mara in the corridor outside the sanctum, at the 3rd hour of the morning, putting on her kitchen coat. Wait, Prithviraj said. Mara waited. The healer stood in the corridor in her formal robes, holding a data tablet that had things on it Mara couldn't read from this distance. She looked at Mara for a moment, not with the formal professional expression, not with the earlier careful and recalibrating expression. Something else. The expression of someone who has spent the night revising what they thought they knew, and is still in the middle of that process. The organism, Prithviraj said. The passive monitoring, we've been watching its retreat over the past few hours since the non-intervention began. We have preliminary models now. She paused. The thing you described about the Darkroot, the mechanism, it's correct. And it's, another pause, it's consistent with at least 3 other biological anomalies we have classified as unknown origin in our records, cases we could not explain. Cases where intervention made things worse and we could not understand why. She looked at the tablet. 712 cases over the past 60 years, cases we marked as unresolved. Mara absorbed this. 712, she said. Yes. And how many of those patients? Dead, Prithviraj said. All but the ones who survived without our help, through mechanisms we didn't understand and therefore didn't investigate. She looked at Mara steadily. The ones who survived were mostly from the outer sectors, where access to formal treatment was limited. Her voice had the quality of someone being very precise about something that was costing them something. We attributed the survival disparity to genetic variants. We published papers on it. We never. She stopped. You never looked at the other explanation, Mara said. That the lack of intervention was the mechanism. No, Prithviraj said, we did not. They stood in the corridor in the 3rd hour of the morning. From the direction of the kitchen, the smell of the scorched broth pot that no one had cleaned yet. We would like to work with you, Prithviraj said. Formally, the delegation, there is clearly a body of knowledge from Sector 12 from the other outer sectors that we have systematically failed to include in our medical framework. Not by malice, by, she searched for the word, by the limits of where we stood, of what we could see from here. I know, Mara said, that's how it usually works. Yes, Prithviraj was quiet for a moment. It should not have taken a crisis of this magnitude to. No, Mara said, it shouldn't have. Another silence, the kind with weight in it. But here we are, Mara said. Here we are, Prithviraj agreed. Mara looked down the corridor toward the kitchen. I have a pot to scrub, she said, and then I'm going to sleep because I've been awake for I don't know how long, a long time. She looked at the healer. Come find me tomorrow with the case files, all 712. She paused. I can't promise I'll be able to explain all of them, but I can tell you what we know in Sector 12, what the window box growers know, what the people who couldn't afford your protocols figured out on their own. Prithviraj looked at her. That's a significant body of knowledge. Yes, Mara said, it is. It should have been included in our records. Yes, Mara said, it should. Prithviraj extended her hand, not the 3-finger gesture of a signed task. The flat palm gesture, Verk, and old, the gesture that appeared in historical texts as the original form of greeting before the formal registers had reorganized everything. The gesture that meant, I see you, not your rank or your function or your assigned place in the hierarchy. You. Mara placed her palm against it. The contact, warm and present and mutual. "Tomorrow," Mara said. "Tomorrow," Prithviraj agreed. She cleaned the pot. She went to her quarters, a small room on the kitchen level, 6 years of small accumulated objects that made it hers. She lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the thing from Junction 11, wherever it was going as it retreated through the king's bloodstream. Back to the dark it came from. Back to the cold spaces between the compact's territory and whatever lay beyond. She thought about what else might be out there. What other things might come from those cold spaces, following no logic except their own. She thought about the compact, which was enormous and ancient and organized, and had faced every threat it knew how to name and had been, for 3 weeks, completely unmade by something it didn't. She thought about a 9-year-old in a quarantine tent. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about what it felt like to stop fighting something long enough to let it tell you what it was. She thought about the king's face when the almost smile had finally reached his eyes. She thought about 712 files. She thought the work is just beginning. She thought I am very tired. She thought there is a kind of warmth in having been useful, not important, not heroic, useful. Having put your hands on something that needed to be held and held it and let it move through. She fell asleep. Outside the palace, the city of the compact's center world moved through its night routines. The watch drums counted their hours. The orbital stations sent their steady signals. In the sanctuary of the inner sanctum, the small dark spot on the Alpha King's left thumb continued its retreat, centimeter by centimeter, smaller and smaller. By the time the first light came up over the palace spires, it was gone. And in a small room on the kitchen level, Mara slept with her hands open, the way her mother had taught her, palms up, fingers loose, holding nothing. Ready when morning came to begin.